Good evening, pals. The first light of morning in Hvitfjord comes slow and silver, as if the sun itself is still deciding whether to rise. Before dawn, the world is drawn in shades of blue and ash. A thin fog hangs over the mouth of the fjord, wrapping the dark water in a soft cloak. In the long house of Hvitfjord, the air is thick with smoke from the hearth, and the breath of sleeping bodies makes the room seem almost alive. Einar wakes to the sounds he has known all his life. The creak of the roof timbers as the house settles. The low murmur of his mother Ingrid stirring outside the sleeping area. The distant call of a gull over the water. He lies still for a long moment, listening. The house is warm, but the chill from the fjord has already found the gap beneath the heavy door. He is 10 winters old, but he feels older in the half-light. His fingers curl around the rough edge of his woolen blanket. There is a knot of nerves in his stomach that is not only because of the day to come. In the months since the snow melted and the barley has begun to push up through the soil, the talk in the hall has changed. The village is growing restless. Every day, men repair their ships, mend their bows, and listen for news from other farms. The songs around the fire are no longer only of harvests and home, but of what lies beyond the horizon. The longhouse is a place of many lives. Einar rises without making a sound and steps carefully over the sleeping bodies. His little sister Sina is curled on a stack of furs near the far wall. Her hair is a bright tangles of flax, and she sleeps with one hand on her cheek. Their grandmother, old Astrid, lies near the hearth with a cracked horn beside her knee. Her chest rises and falls in a rhythm as steady as a drumbeat. In the corner, the family's dog, Bay, lifts his head and gives a low whine. Einar pats him and moves toward the door. Outside, the world is still. Frost glitters on the reeds. The fjord is a black mirror, and a longship rests on wooden rollers near the waterline, its dragon-headed prow turned toward the sea. Men are already there, moving with quiet purpose. Some carry bundles of rope. Others rub tar into the seams of the hull. The sound of their voices is small, like weathered stones shifting in a river. Hvitfjord is the first to see Einar. His father stands beside the ship, his leather jerkin damp with dew, his hair still wild from sleep. The lines around his eyes seem deeper today. He has always been a farmer, first a man who knows the mood of the soil by pressing his fingers into it. But the land of Hvitfjord is spared no hunger. The winters are long and hungry, the soil thin, and every year the family stretches what they have. There is always a promise of more in the distance. Einar, Halvard says softly, not the stern call he uses when he is angry, but the one he uses when something heavy sits between them. Come here. Einar crosses the frost-crisped ground. There is a smell of pine tar and wet wood. The longship is magnificent in a simple way. Its hull is built of overlapping planks fastened together with iron rivets, the wood polished smooth by the hands of many men. The oars lie in bundles along the deck waiting. The prow is carved into the shape of a beast, its mouth open and eyes fierce. The dragon seems to drink the dawn. There is talk again from the north, Halvard says. He points to the horizon where the fjord narrows into a ribbon of pale light. The chief in Nordheim sends his men to the west. There are tales of silver of a monastery on an island with treasures from the south. The sea runs full now. The time to go is come. Einar nods, though his heart quickens. He has been on the edge of talk and preparation for months, but this is the first time he hears the word raid spoken so close to home. The word itself is sharp in the morning air. Will you go? He asks. Halvard does not answer at once. He looks past his son to the slow smoke curling from the hearth of the hall. A man does not always choose the road he walks, he says, finally. A man chooses whether he goes with his head held high or with fear in his gut. The sea takes what it will, Einar. But it also gives. Einar remembers the first story his father ever told him. It was not of battle. It was of a boy who carried a basket of rye across the ice of a mare that gave birth in the snow of a morning when the sun broke through the clouds and warmed the frozen ground enough to let the children run barefoot. The sea and the field are both roads, his father had said. They are both places where a man proves himself. Ingrid appears at the doorway wrapped in a woolen cloak. She has a cloth bundle in her arms. Take this, she says, handing it to Einar. Inside is dried meat cheese and a small loaf of barley bread. Her eyes are bright with unshed tears. Keep it dry. Keep your sword sharp. And if the gods are with you, come back. Einar takes the bundle with clumsy hands. The leather of the bread pouch is still warm from his mother's fingers. He thinks of Signa, of his grandmother, of the smell of the hall, and of the promise of a world beyond the fjord. For the first time, the horizon seems more than a line where sky meets water. It is a door that may open to gold or to grief. The men from Nordheim have been preparing for this since early spring. They have carved shields and bent new bows. Smoke rises from the communal forge as the blacksmith hammers iron into spear points. The air is filled with the scent of wet earth pine and the sharp tang of iron. A boy from another farm, older than Einar and already bearing the faint scars of a winter spent sharpening knives, nods to Einar when he approaches. He is named Bjorn. His hair is a pale yellow, his jaw still soft, but his eyes are hard. If you are coming, Bjorn says, you will need to learn the first rule. What is that? Hold your shield close. Your life is behind it. Einar takes his place by the edge of the fjord. The longship is almost ready. The crew is a mix of men from Hvitfjord and Nordheim with different scar patterns and different stories behind their eyes. Some are old enough to remember raids before Einar was born. Some are young like him, with the raw excitement of boys who have not yet known the weight of loss. There are men who have married a year ago and still sleep with a knife beneath their pillow. There are men who have taken new wives from places farther south and carry a look of both pride and exhaustion. Freydis is there too. She is not part of the crew from Nordheim, but she stands with them as if she has a right to be there. Her hair is a storm of dark braids, and a hand-sized scar crosses her cheek from a childhood fall. She was born to a farmer and a rune carver, and even at 10, she has an ease with a spear that Einar envies. She looks at him and tilts her head. You look like you're going to leave a piece of yourself on this shore, she says, her voice low. Einar grips the drum of his shield. Maybe I am, he replies. She smiles, and in her eyes there is the same fierce curiosity that has always been there. Then take enough with you that you can find it again. The longship slides into the water with a soft sigh. The men strain on their oars, the boat gliding away from the beach like a living thing waking. The fjord is narrow at first, enclosed by steep cliffs and dark pines. The air is colder here, and the cliffs echo the creak of wood and the rhythmic splash of oars. As the ship moves, Einar thinks of the things he is leaving behind: his mother's steady hands, his sister's laughter, the warmth of the hearth that has watched over his family for generations. He also thinks of the stories told in the longhouse, the ones that have shaped his imagination. There was the story of King Harold's first longship, carved from a single oak and painted in blood and snow. There was the tale of the woman who crossed the sea to fetch a bride for her husband, carrying a sword and a promise. There was the legend of Odin, who hung himself from the world tree to learn the runes, paying a terrible price for knowledge. Beyond the curve of the fjord, the sea opens into a wide expanse. The water is dark and restless, freckled with whitecaps. The horizon is a soft gray line where sky and water meet. For the first time, Einar feels the vastness of the world. The sea is no longer a lake to cross. It is a road that leads to other peoples, other gods, other dangers. The men on the ship chant a prayer. It is not a hymn like the monks of the south would sing. It is a short invocation to the gods they know. Odin, wise one they call, Thor Hammerer, Nord master of the wave, watch over our keel. Keep the frost from our bones. Let the wind be at our backs. Let the wolf not come close. Einar closes his eyes and feels the words pass over him. His heart beats in time with the stroke of the oar. The ship rides the swell. Behind him, the shore of Hvitfjord recedes, the green of the hills fading into the mist. There is a strange calm in the center of his fear. The world ahead is uncertain, yes, but it also carries a promise that has hung in the stories of his people since before he was born. The Vikings of the North were not born from a single battle. They were born from a hunger for more food, more honor, more tales to tell beside the fire. They were born from the belief that the sea was a path rather than a prison. The first chapter of Einar's story is not the stealing of treasure or the screaming of battle. It is the moment before the first clash, when the cold air is filled with a new sound, the steady beat of oars, the opening of the sea, the quiet resolve of a boy who has chosen to leave his hearth in order to find out what lies beyond. As the longship cuts through the fjord and sails toward the open sea, the morning light strengthens. The mist lifts from the water in thin ribbons. The dragonhead prow seems to sniff the air. And in the longhouse back on the shore, Ingrid draws a blanket around old Astrid and listens, as she always has, to the stories that drift from the harbor, with the tide stories of men who leave and may or may not return, stories that are waiting to be told again. In this first part of the tale, the world of the Viking Age begins not with a scream, but with a decision. It begins with a boy named Einar and the sound of the fjord, the sound of a longship leaving the safety of what is known to find out what the world might offer if one has the courage to take it. The The longship rode the swell like a sleeping beast. The oars dipped and rose with the rhythm of a heartbeat, steady and unbroken. The men aboard were quiet at first, each lost in his own thoughts. Some stared at the gray horizon. Some checked their weapons one last time, fingers tracing the leather-wrapped hilts of knives and the rough grain of their shields. Einar stood near the prow, his shield strapped to his left arm and a short sword hanging from his belt. The sea spray kissed his face cold and sharp. His chest felt tight with a mixture of fear and excitement he had never known before. Behind him, the long house of Hvitfjord was already a memory, the dark line of its roof shrinking with every stroke. The ship cut through the mist and eventually turned south. The fjord opened into the wider ocean and the air changed. Here there was no shelter from the wind. The sea stretched away in an endless sheet, broken only by the white foam that chased the bow. The sky above was the color of iron, and the sun was a pale coin behind clouds. The crew sang softly, not so much a prayer as a promise. Their voices rose in a thin, ancient cadence. Odin, god of the hungered heart. Thor, thunder on the path apart. Njord, whose breath is wave and tide. Guide our keel, be at our side. The words anchored Einar. He had heard them before beside the hearth, but there they had been part of a story. Now they were his own. The day they reached the island where the monastery lay, the air carried a new scent. It was the smell of smoke and wet earth, but there was also sweetness in it, of herbs and old wood. The island rose from the water like a stone tossed into a pool, with mossy rocks and a ring of low buildings inside a rough wall. The monastery itself was small, a cluster of whitewashed huts with a single round tower rising above the rest. A bell hung in the tower, though it was not ringing. The word church had come to the Norsemen from men who spoke differently, but everyone aboard knew what it meant. This place held more than men. It held faith and books and crafts they had not seen before. A lookout named Hakon pointed with a calloused finger. "There are people on the shore," he said. "No warriors yet. Only the brethren." Einar's stomach tightened. The men of the crew shifted. Some checked their shields. The raider from Thorfinn's band, the one who had been to England before, spat into the sea and said, "Then we take quickly and leave quickly." The longship slid into the shallows. The gunwale scraped over stone. Men leaped out, with the practiced ease of those who had done it many times before. Einar followed boots sinking into cold water, the weight of his shield heavy but solid in his hand. They moved up the beach. The monks had already seen them. A small group stood between the door of the church and the shore hands lifted, not in anger, but in prayer. Their faces were pale and drawn. One of them wore a rough wool habit. Another held a small wooden cross close to his chest, as if it could keep him safe. In that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Hvitfjord was at Einar's side. His eyes were hard, but there was no joy in them. The chant of the raiders rose around them, fierce and hot. The first clash was sudden. A monk stumbled backward, a look of horror on his face, and the world filled with the sound of shields striking wood and the sharp crack of axes. Einar's first blow was not precisely aimed. It felt as if he had been struck himself. His sword found a leather belt, not a body, and he saw the monk's eyes widen. For a heartbeat, their gaze met. The monk seemed no older than Einar, with brown hair falling over his forehead and fear etched in every line of his face. Einar's arm shook. Then something deeper than fear took over. He had been given a role, and his training with Bjorn and the other boys had prepared him for this. His shield rose. He felt the hard impact of another man's axe against his own shield and answered with a push forward that drove the man back. The raid became a living thing, movement, sound, breath. Men screamed. Wood splintered. The air filled with the metallic cry of iron and the wet sound of bodies falling. Silver coins clattered underfoot. A monk cried out a name in his own strange tongue. Einar moved through it all with a strange detachment. He did not feel like the boy who had stepped onto the longship hours before. He felt as if the sea itself had taken him and wrapped him in its cold strength. The rush was like a storm at sea. He struck, he defended, he followed the command of his father and the men beside him. And then it was over. In the span of a few heartbeats, the monastery was broken. The raiders had taken what they had come for: a chest of silver hidden in a cupboard, a small wooden cross carved inlaid with metal, and a stack of parchments bound with string. They set fire to the longhouse, so the flames would drive the smoke high and draw no attention from a greater distance. The bell in the tower tolled once, a forlorn sound that seemed out of place among the roar of the fire. Einar stood near the shore, his hair damp with sweat, his breath coming hard. The raiders around him were shouting, some in triumph, some in grief. He saw a monk stumble out of the burning door, clutching a book to his chest. The man's habit was singed, and his hands shook. Einar's first instinct was to raise his sword to drive the man back the way he had come. But the next moment, he saw the book itself. The cover was worn, the edges blackened by smoke. The monk's eyes met his, and in them there was not hatred, only a desperate desire to save something. Einar lowered his sword. One of the older raiders, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, laughed. "Do you pity them now, boy?" Einar did not answer. The monk slipped past him, running toward the tree line. The book burned in his hands, but he did not drop it. Einar felt the emptiness of the answer. They had come for silver and treasure. They had taken it. They had also taken something else, whether they knew it or not, the knowledge that men like the monks guarded a different kind of wealth. That night, when they camped on the far side of the island, the fire was louder than any Einar had heard before. The smoke curled upward, carrying with it the scent of wet wood and the sweet tang of burned herbs. The silver lay in a rough barrel. A few of the men counted it by torchlight, their faces glowing red and gold. The cross and the parchments were tucked away in a bundle, guarded by Hvitfjord himself. Einar sat at the edge of the camp, his shield against his knees. His fingers were raw from the handle of his sword. His body was tired in a way that no harvest work had ever made him. He watched the flames dance and thought of the monk running with the book, of the way the bell had sounded, of the prayer he had heard in his own tongue. Hvitfjord came and sat beside him. The elder's gaze was fixed on the fire. "You did well," he said quietly. "You held your shield. You struck true when you needed to. But remember, this Einar victory is not only counted in silver." "What else is it counted in?" Einar asked. Hvitfjord picked up a small bone from the ground and rolled it between his fingers. "In what you leave behind and in what you bring back. In the weight of what you carry on your soul. We are not only raiders. We are men who have homes, wives, children. The sea gives us a chance to take. It also gives us the chance to learn what we must leave in order not to be swallowed by our own deeds." Einar did not fully understand. The flames cast strange shadows on his father's face. The night was noisy with the murmurs of men and the crackle of burning wood. A gull cried far overhead. As he lay down that night beneath a blanket on the damp ground, with the roar of the fire in his ears, Einar thought of the silence before dawn on the fjord. He thought of the longhouse in Hvitfjord of Sina, sleeping in the corner of his mother's hands, folded in worry. He thought of the monk and his book. In the quiet of his mind, the taste of the day's violence remained bitter. In the first raid, Einar had crossed a threshold. He had left the simple stories of home and entered the harsher truth of the wider world. The world beyond the fjord was no longer an imagined place of treasure and glory. It was a place where people like him did terrible things and then had to live with the consequences. It was a place where the stories of the North met the stories of the South, and neither side understood the other fully. As the fire burned low and the men drifted to sleep around him, Einar made a silent promise to himself. He would not forget the look in the monk's eyes. He would carry it with him through the voyages yet to come, through the trade and the journeys and the battles. It would be a quiet part of his story, like a hidden rune carved in wood. And when the time came to return to Hvitfjord, he would know if he had become the kind of man his father had hoped he could be. Thus ends part 2, and the first true test of what it means to be a Norseman in a world that is changing as fast as the tides. The morning after the raid came with an ache in Einar's muscles he had never known before. His shoulders were stiff from the shield, his fingers blistered from the sword hilt, and his mind was restless. The longship rocked gently in the shallow cove where they had made camp. The men moved more slowly now, no longer driven only by the fever of battle. They had their price, and the sea that had carried them here was already calling them away. Einar woke before dawn again, as he had on the day the ship left Hvitfjord. The sky was pale blue, and the wind was cold. He stepped out of the shelter and watched the water. It seemed calmer than it had been the day before, as if the sea itself were catching its breath. The fire from the night still glowed in the embers, sending thin threads of smoke up into the air. Hvitfjord was already awake, stirring the coals and checking the ropes that tied the ship to the shore. His eyes were clearer than they had been around the fire. "We leave before the sun climbs high," he said when he saw Einar. "The current will be kinder." Einar nodded. The raid had changed him in ways he could not yet name. He felt both lighter, because the weight of expectation had been eased by action, and heavier, because he had seen something that had not been part of the stories he had grown up with. Yet now the world opened again in a different direction, not toward another fight, but toward places where men spoke different words and traded different goods they pushed the ship back into the water. The oars were lifted, and the men took their places. The longship moved away from the burning monastery and toward the wider ocean. The coast vanished behind them. For a while, there was only the rhythm of the oars and the sound of wind through rope. By midday, they were no longer in the narrow fjord. The coast of the monastery was a smudge on the horizon, and the ocean spread out endless and shimmering. The sun peeked through the clouds, warming the deck. The smell of salt filled Einar's nostrils. For the first time since leaving home, he allowed himself to look around with the wonder he had felt as a boy listening to skalds' tales. They sailed west, guided by the sun and by the knowledge of the men who had crossed this water before. The sea was not always gentle. There were days when the wind rose suddenly, tossing the ship and filling the sails with wild power. On those days, the men worked as one, pulling ropes, bracing against the deck, chanting to keep their courage. On calmer days, they repaired their gear, wove basketry, and spoke of strange lands. When they reached the Hebrides, the shore was covered in green hills and stone walls, and the air was sharp with the scent of peat smoke. The first sight of another people's settlement made Einar's heart race. There were small houses with rounded roofs, and figures moved at the edge of a field. Cattle grazed in the mist. The men of the crew tensed, expecting conflict. But the people who greeted them did not come with spears. They came with curious eyes. A trader from the town stepped forward when the Norsemen reached the beach. He was a broad man with dark hair tied back and a cloak of leather. He spoke in a language that was strange and soft to Einar's ears, but one of the Norsemen knew a few words. "Peace," the man said. "Goods." "Trade." The first exchange was cautious. The Norseman offered wool and salted fish. In return, the trader gave them fine linen and small bronze knives. Einar watched as the two groups touched each item and smiled when the cloth was soft in their hands. There was no clang of swords, only the quiet business of value being agreed upon. Einar learned an important lesson there, one that had not been taught in the fjord. The sea could carry not only axes and shields, but cloth grain and friendship. There was profit in trade, and there was meaning in the ability to bring home goods that their own land could not make. After the Hebrides, they sailed along the coast of Ireland. The villages they saw were different from home. Houses were rounder, with low, thick walls of stone. The people wore bright cloth. There were boats with high curved ends. The Norsemen called them curraghs, and they marveled at the way they skimmed over the waves. One day, in a crowded market by a river, Einar met Brigid. She was a young woman with hair the color of ripe barley and eyes like the wet stones of a stream. She stood beside a stall stacked with amber beads and leather pouches. Her hands moved quickly, tying knots and arranging her goods. Einar watched her from the edge of the market, feeling both shy and fascinated. When Brigid noticed him, she offered him a string of amber without a word. He took it. The beads were warm from her touch. "For your mother," she said, in the soft tongue of the people here. Einar did not understand the exact words, but the meaning came through in her gesture and in the way she looked at him. He wanted to say something kind in return. He reached for a knife with a carved handle and held it out. Brigid examined it, then nodded. "For your journey," she said, and wrapped the knife in a piece of cloth. Einar spent the afternoon with Brigid, learning a few words of her language and telling her the simplest things about his own home. She laughed when he described the fjord and the longship. She told him that in her town the church bells rang for morning and evening, that they harvested barley and took care of geese, and that some of their people had heard of the fierce sea traders from the north. The world felt larger and softer in Brigid's presence. She did not make him feel like a warrior or a raider. She made him feel like a boy with something to share. Not all encounters were gentle. In one town, the Norsemen encountered a group of warriors who had learned to fight like them. They were armored in leather and chain, their shields painted in patterns unfamiliar to Einar. The men of the crew laughed nervously. The battle that followed was not on a wide field, but in a narrow street lined with stone houses. The sound of clashing metal was sharp and close. Smoke rose from a cart that had caught fire. A young man from the town fell, and Einar's spear narrowly missed another warrior's thigh. He learned there that not every place welcomed them. Some people had stories of Norse ships coming and taking what they wanted. Some had built walls and sharpened their spears in preparation. In those moments, the sea felt like a sword that could wound its bearer as well as its enemies. Still, there were times when Einar discovered kindness even in the midst of strangeness. In a quiet village along the coast, he watched a woman in a wool apron feed her child from a bowl of stew. She looked up at the Norseman and smiled, then walked over and placed a piece of rye bread in Einar's hand. Her eyes were gentle. "We are not all enemies," she said in the same soft language he had begun to understand. Einar carried the bread back to the ship. It tasted of earth and warmth. He thought of home and of the way his mother had always made sure there was bread for everyone. The gesture was simple, but in it he felt the first true echo of the idea that the world beyond the fjord could be more than a place of raids. It could be a place of shared meals and shared stories. Days turned into weeks. The longship crossed waters that had been only stories to Einar. They followed the coast of Brittany. They saw white cliffs rising from the sea, their faces streaked with gulls. They met traders who spoke of wine and salt from the south. They saw monasteries perched on islands with tiny cells where men prayed in silence. On one windless afternoon, as the sun hung low and gilded the water, the men on the ship saw a land unlike any they had seen before. The trees were taller, the grass softer, and wild grapes hung heavy on the vines. The air was sweeter. Einar felt a thrill that ran through him like lightning. Vinland. One of the men whispered the name, whispered as if it were a magic spell. They anchored in a sheltered bay. The forest beyond the shore was dense and green. Birds called from the trees. The land smelled of fruit and flowers. The men stepped onto the beach with a sense of awe. For the first time, Einar stood in a place that was not carved by the hard hand of northern winters. It was a land of abundance. They found rivers full of fish and woods full of game. They tasted grapes that stained their lips purple. They built a small hall from the trees, their axes ringing with a different sound, not the sound of war, but of settlement. They planted seeds. They learned from the people they called Skraelings how to use the land around them. They traded with them, and though there were moments of fear and misunderstanding, there were also moments of laughter around the fire. Einar learned another lesson in Vinland. There was bravery in the decision to stay, to build, to make a home in a place that felt both strange and generous. The sea had brought them there, but the land asked them to remain. It asked them to be more than raiders and more than traders. He thought of Hvitfjord, of the small fields and the longhouse smoke. He thought of Sina's laugh and his mother's hands. He thought of the monk's eyes and the woman in Ireland with the gentle smile. His heart was pulled between what he had left behind and what he had found. By the time the longship set course for the north again, Einar was no longer the boy who had stood at the prow on his first voyage. He had seen markets and monasteries, kindness and war, foreign tongues and familiar gestures. He had learned that the world beyond the fjord was wide enough to hold both steel and softness. As the ship sailed home, the sea carried him forward, and the horizon behind him carried his memories. He did not yet know how those memories would shape the man he would become. But he knew that the Viking Age was not only about the raids that filled the longhouse stories, it was also about the long waters that connected people, the trade that made distant goods feel close, and the choice to answer the world's call with both courage and care. The return from Vinland carried a quiet in Einar's bones that no storm had ever managed. The longship moved through familiar waters with a new kind of ease. The men still sang as they rowed, but their voices were softer, threaded with stories of green fields and foreign faces. The sea had carried them far, and it had also carried back the knowledge that the world beyond the fjord could be a place of settlement as much as a place of raid. When Hvitfjord finally appeared ahead of them, the cliffs were the same dark gray, the pines the same deep green, and the line of the longhouse roof was unchanged. Yet everything felt altered. The air seemed sharper, the smell of home richer. Einar's heart beat faster as the ship cut into the narrow fjord and the longhouse grew larger in his vision. The village had changed too, if only in small ways. New fences stood where there had been gaps. A stone wall had been added to the sheep pasture. Children ran along the shore with a looseness Einar remembered from his own childhood. He slid from the boat and felt the familiar gauve of packed earth beneath his feet. The longhouse door creaked open, and a stream of people stepped out onto the stone threshold. Inside, the fire was already banked. The same bench by the wall remained where Einar had sat as a boy. Sina was there taller now, her hair braided and her eyes wide with the surprise of seeing him. She ran forward and threw her arms around his waist. The warmth of her embrace was an anchor. Ingrid Einar called his voice thick. His mother emerged from the sleeping area, her hands still dusted with flour. She looked older, and the lines around her mouth were deeper, but when she saw him, her face brightened like the sun breaking through clouds. "My son," she whispered, and her hands went to his cheeks. Old Astrid was seated near the hearth, her fingers wrapped around a carved wooden cup. She watched with a wry smile. "So the sea did not keep you after all," she said, her voice thin but steady. Einar stepped into the heart of the hall. The familiar smell of smoke and stew wrapped around him. The long house seemed to exhale as if it had been holding its breath while he was gone. He looked at the faces around him. Some were new. Some were those of men he had left behind. Hvitfjord stood by the fire, his arms folded. The first thing Einar saw was the same look of steadiness, but there was also a softer edge now, a hint of pride and of understanding. "You have grown," Hvitfjord said, simply. Einar did not need more. He took a seat and let the warmth of the hearth seep into his bones. The world outside had taught him new things, but the longhouse taught him an older lesson, that home is not only a place, but the people who keep the flame burning. Over the next weeks, the village settled once more into the rhythms of farm life. The harvest came in. The longhouse doors opened to the cold mornings and the smell of damp earth. The men mended nets and repaired plows. The women spun wool and tended the children. The longships rested on the beach, their hulls black with tar, waiting for the next season. Yet the stories did not stop. They grew richer and more complex as the men returned from far places. At night, the hall filled with the sounds of voices and of the lyre. The skald Njal would take his place near the hearth and sing not only of old gods and ancient heroes, but of the green fields of Finland and of the markets in Ireland. He wove the new into the old so that the younger children who had never sailed beyond the fjord could taste a larger world. "Listen," Njal would say to the story of the Northmen when the days were long and the seas were wide. "Remember that we are not only raiders, but builders. We are not only warriors, but families. We are the children of the North, and our voices carry farther than the song of any storm." Freydis became a frequent presence in the hall. Her shadow passed through like a gust of wind, quick and alive. When she spoke, the room leaned in. She had become more than the girl who could lift a shield. She had returned from the east with tales of the great river peoples of the glittering city, where the stones were polished and the traders wore silks from a land called Miklagard. "There is a market there," she told the men one evening, "where a man can buy precious glass and spices so strong they make the nose burn. There are strangers who eat with knives of bent iron and who bow their heads for prayers that carry the scent of incense." Einar listened, his eyes wide. He had thought the sea itself was the great adventure. Freydis made him feel that it was only one path among many. One day, the chieftain of Nordheim came to visit. He arrived with a small company, his cloak bright and his hair braided in a way that marked him as a man of rank. He brought with him a letter carved in runes and sealed with wax, a message from a king in the south, asking for men to serve as guards for a caravan. The room stilled as the chieftain spoke. "The world is changing," he said. "Kings in the south are growing stronger. There is more to gain by law and by trade than by burning. We must decide whether we will follow only the old ways or whether we will also walk the new paths." Hvitfjord folded and unfolded his hands. "We have always walked both," he replied. "We have always fed our children and set sail. The question is not whether we change, but how we keep our hearts while we change." Einar's role in the village shifted subtly. He was no longer only the boy who had gone on his first raid. He helped teach the younger ones to carry oars, to mend sails, to read the sky. He also learned to read the runes better, not only the ones etched on weapons, but the ones carved on stones that marked promises and laws. He discovered that a rune could hold the weight of a contract as well as the memory of a battle. The summers of the Northmen were long and golden. The barley ripened under slow suns. Children ran in fields of wildflowers. The boats along the shore carried not only shields, but baskets of produce and bundles of furs. The longhouse filled with laughter and with the quiet contentment of work done well. Einar found himself drawn to more than the sea. He walked the fields with Hvitfjord feeling the difference between plowing and paddling. He learned to listen to the soil, to know when the earth was tired and when it was ready. He found a strange satisfaction in the simple act of planting a seed and watching it sprout. The same patience that steadied a man in battle steadied a man in a field. Yet, when the first chill of autumn touched the tips of the grasses, the sea's call returned. The longship on the beach seemed to pulse with possibility. New messengers arrived with news from foreign lands. There were whispers of a king in Norway who sought to unite the northern chieftain. There were tales of an abbey in England where the walls were lined with written books and the monks spoke of a single God called Christ. Einar sat with Freydis one evening on the headland above the fjord. The sun was low, casting a blood-red light over the water. Below them, the longhouse smoke curled up like a question. "Do you ever feel torn?" Einar asked. Freydis tossed a stray pebble into the sea. "Every day," she said, "but I also feel that the world has room for both. I have stood on the deck of a longship with a sword in my hand, and I have also stood by a market stall, trading cloth. I have listened to a skald sing of Thor and to a monk pray to Christ. Perhaps we are not meant to choose only one. Einar nodded. He thought of the monk with the book of the woman in Ireland with the gentle smile of the green vines of Finland. He thought of his mother's bread and his father's steady work. There was a strange comfort in knowing that the Viking Age was as much about these quiet choices as about the loud ones. His relationship with his father deepened. Hvitfjord began to speak to him not just as a son, but as a man. When I was your age, Hvitfjord said one afternoon while they repaired a fence, I thought a man's worth was only the weight of his sword. Then I married your mother and fed a child in winter. Then I learned to worry for a farm. The sea is a gift, but so is the land. Do not let one make you forget the other. Einar listened, and he began to understand the true meaning of the lesson. The Viking Age was not only a season of raiding and sailing. It was also a long summer of settling, of building halls and families, of choosing when to fight and when to trade, of carving runes in memory of both the past and the future. The chapter of the long summer is the one where the Norsemen became more than a storm passing through. They became neighbors and fathers, traders and storytellers. They laid foundations in foreign soil and carried their names into distant places. Einar stood at the center of that change, seeing the world not as a single road to conquer, but as many paths that could be walked together. As the sun set each night, the longhouse filled with stories. Njal sang of the men who had gone south and returned with bronze and silk. Freydis shared tales of a city where the stones were white and the roofs gleamed. Einar began to tell his own story, not as a boy who left the fjord, but as a man who had come back, carrying the wide world in his heart. The long summer of the Northmen stretched on heavy with memory and possibility. It was a time when the Viking Age revealed its deeper truth that the greatest voyages are not only those across the sea, but those that carry a people from one way of life into another, while honoring the place they came from. In the quiet of the longhouse, with the fire glowing and the children drifting to sleep, Einar knew that this was the season he would remember most, when the Vikings learned to be more than warriors, and when home and horizon were finally held in the same hand. The years after Vinland unfolded like a slow gathering storm. It did not crack the sky all at once, but its pressure built in the land and in the hearts of men. Einar watched the world change around him, not only in the sails on the fjord, but in the way people spoke, prayed, and lived. The first sign was in Nordheim. The chieftain, who had once stood proudly at the head of a raid, now wore a crown of iron and sat under a carved bench at a Thing meeting. Men from different farms came with their own tales and their own grievances. They spoke not only of raids, but of laws and debts of marriages and alliances. The idea that a king could demand tribute rather than a chieftain could offer a feast was no longer a rumor. It was a reality. One autumn, a messenger arrived from the south and carried with him a silvered seal. The letter was written in runes, but the phrases were foreign. King of the Angles, honor the peace. It asked for men who would serve as guards for a caravan passing through, promising pay in silver and a share of the goods. The best men from Nordheim and Hvitfjord gathered to hear the terms. Halvard listened with his jaw set. There is more to gain here than the weight of a sword, he said. If we can guard the trade, we can bring wealth to our farms without burning anyone's hall. Einar felt the weight of that decision. It was not enough to know how to fight. One must also know when to lay down the axe and take another road. The men who chose to go south traveled not as raiders, but as escorts. They wore the same leather and carried the same shields, but their purpose was different: to protect merchants, to ensure the peace held, to be a part of a wider web of trust. The second sign came in the form of stone. In Hvitfjord, a longhouse elder, whose hands had once shaped oak into a prow now chipped at a slab of granite. The people were building not only wooden walls, but stone foundations for a new church. Monks had come north again, speaking quietly, painting crosses on doorposts, and telling of a single God whose mercy was as wide as the sea. Some in the village were eager. Some were suspicious. The old gods still lived in the stories Njal told of Thor's hammer and Odin's sacrifice. But along the shore beside the dragon-headed longships, a simple stone building began to rise with a cross on its roof. Einar sat with Freydis by the half-built chapel one afternoon. The air smelled of damp stone and fresh timber. Men lifted stones, and women carried baskets of lime. The chapel was small, its walls rough, but its presence was heavy. "It feels strange," Einar said, tracing a rune carved into a piece of scrap wood. Freydis nodded. "Change always does. But I have seen more than one kind of courage now. There is the courage to stand with a spear in hand. There is the courage to let new things into your life and still keep the old." In the same months, the people of Hvitfjord saw a familiar story take a different turn. A farmer in the next valley, whose family had long taken pride in raiding the southern isles, chose instead to marry a woman from England. His hall opened to new tastes and new songs. His children learned to speak a new language, and his house was built with boards that had never been salted by northern storms. The Vikings were still Vikings, but they were also becoming something broader: farmers who married far traders, who shared goods, men who prayed in both Old Norse and Christian tongues. The storm of change did not spare battle. The defenses in the south grew stronger. Villages that had once fled at the sight of a dragon-headed prow now met the Sea King with sharpened stakes and wall. Einar himself led a small band of guards once not to raid, but to protect a caravan of merchants moving along the coast. They rode far enough that the trees of Norway were only a memory. They listened as the merchants spoke of roads paved with stone and laws written down. They saw how a village could prosper not only by taking, but by holding steady and honoring an agreement. On that journey, Einar met a man named Leofric, a trader from the lands of the Angles. Leofric's hair was dark and his beard trimmed. His hands were scarred from rope-knot battle. He spoke of the market in York, of cows traded for silver, of quilts sewn with care. He told Einar that the world was not only red with blood, but gold with opportunity. "You sailors of the north," Leofric said one evening by a campfire, "you are like the wind. You can cut through any line. But if you can bend like the grass in the same wind, you will last longer than the strongest oak." Einar took those words deep. They echoed in his bones when he returned to Hvitfjord. The sea was still his blood, but he began to understand that the land, the law, and the ties between people mattered just as much. The third sign of the storm came from the east. Freydis returned from a voyage to the lands of the Rus with a belt of fine metal and stories that seemed like dreams. She had stood in a city where the roofs shone and where people traded amber for silver and silk. She had listened to men pray in a language she could not understand. She had watched a procession of glimmering banners and drums so deep they were felt in the chest. They called their city Miklagard. She told the gathered men, her eyes bright. "It is a city of gold and strange gods, and a river that runs like a silver snake. The women there wear veils. The men speak with a song to it. They have a king who rules with a fist, but they also have a law that holds because everyone knows the name of the law." Einar saw the storm in her words. The world was no longer a handful of coasts and fjords. It was a web stretching east and south and west. The Vikings had woven themselves into it, and now the web pulled back. At home, Einar's family adjusted once more. Sina married a young man from Nordheim, and their hall held both the old stories of Hvitfjord and the names of kings from England. Old Astrid grew quieter, but her eyes still sparkled when a skald sang of Thor. The stone chapel held its first service one late autumn, the smell of incense mingling with pine smoke. Halvard knelt not with a sword in hand, but with calloused hands, folded. Einar understood now that the storm was not simply the end of the Viking Age. It was the beginning of the next chapter. The raiders would still sail and the shields would still be raised. But their shape would change. The longships would carry more than blades. They would carry merchants, settlers, and stories. The gods of the old world would remain alive in the minds of those who remembered them, while the cross of the new faith would stand beside them. One night, as winter pressed close and snow began to dust the pine branches, Einar stood on the headland above the fjord. The world stretched beneath him, dark water, sleeping boats, the distant glow of halls. The sky was full of stars, cold and bright. He felt the storm in his chest, yes, but he also felt a calm that came from holding both the past and the future at once. The Viking Age had been a fire that would not be kept forever. But the embers would carry on in the families, the farms, the laws, and the tales. The storm was not only ending, it was making room for something else. As he turned back toward the hall, he carried the memory of green grapes in Vinland, the chant of the men on the longship, the first raid, and the monks' desperate flight, the stone church rising beside the longhouse, and the distant city of Miklagard. The world was changing, but the heart of the North still beat strong. It beat not only for the thrill of conquest, but for the hard work of building a future where the sea and the land could both be honored. This was the storm of change, a season when the Viking Age began to fold into the larger story of Europe, when the Norse people learned to be as much neighbors as they were warriors, and when Einar's generation stood between the old world and the new, carrying both in their hands. Winter's first snow came soft and slow, a quieting blanket over Hvitfjord. The pines bowed under white dust, and the fjord surface had begun to gray and harden at the edges. The longhouse glowed in the dusk, a steady heart of light against the cold. Inside, the air was warm and full of the scent of stew bread and burning pine. Einar stood by the fire, his cloak wrapped tight around his shoulders. The years had settled into the lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples. His hands still remembered the grip of the oar and the hard edge of an axe, but they also knew the texture of wool and the ease of woven rope. The quiet of the hall felt good in a way that made him grateful for the land he had known before the sea called him away. Sina sat across from him, nursing a small girl in her lap. The child was his niece now, with hair as bright as flax and eyes that watched the flames with deep curiosity. She reached out and touched her uncle's beard, laughing when his skin tickled. Einar's heart softened. "Tell her," Sina said the story of the first ship. Einar looked down at the child and smiled. He thought of the longship leaving Hvitfjord all those years ago, of the cold fjord, and of the way his world had grown beyond the hills. He knew he could tell the tale in many ways: the danger, the silver, the foreign tongues. But what mattered most now were the quiet moments in between. There was a day when the sea was gray as stone, he said softly. And there was a boy who stood on the shore and wondered if the world was larger than his own farm. He did not know all he would learn. He only knew that he could not live quietly forever. So he stepped into the boat, and the waves carried him toward more than he had ever imagined. The little girl clapped, and the others in the hall listened. Njal plucked his lyre and began a low tune beneath Einar's words, threading the story into the old music. Outside, snowflakes drifted down in wide, slow spirals. The world seemed to wrap itself in white, as if to listen. In the quiet hearth of Hvitfjord, Einar thought of the many roads he had walked. He had been a warrior in a monastery raid, a trader in a market of strangers, a settler in the green lands of Vinland, and a guard on the caravan routes of the south. He had eaten with monks and laughed with merchants. He had stood in halls where the old gods were praised, and in chapels where the new faith was spoken in a low voice. He had also learned the importance of home. The hall was more than shelter. It was the place where stories were kept and passed down. It was where his father had taught him that the sea and the field were both roads. It was where his mother had wrapped bread in cloth and sent him away. It was where his sister now kept the fire alive, and her own daughter gathered warmth. The longhouse was full that winter. The children ran between benches, their laughter bright and free. The elders sat with cups in their hands, their voices low as they spoke of weather and seeds. The newcomers from other lands shared food and stories. The air was full of the sounds of life, and yet there was a peace more profound than any battlefield calm. Einar had grown to understand that the true strength of a people was not only the sharpness of their swords, but the steadiness of their heart. He had been tested in war, yes, but he had also been tested in the quiet work of coming home. One evening, as the fire burned low and the snow outside thickened into silence, Halvard came and sat beside Einar. The elder's hands were rough from the soil, but they rested gently now. "You have done well, son," Halvard said, his voice older but sure. "You have brought back more than stories. You have brought back a sense of what we can be." Einar touched his father's shoulder. "I could not have done it without what I learned here," he replied. "The sea taught me courage. The land taught me patience. Home taught me what to keep." Halvard nodded. "The world will keep turning. New kings will rise. New faiths will spread. Our grandchildren may not take the same longships you did, but they will still need a hearth that remembers why we sailed in the first place." A quiet fell between them, the kind that only years of shared work can make comfortable. Outside, the wind sang softly in the pines, and the sound of the fjord under ice was distant and muted. That winter, Einar took the time to teach the children of Hvitfjord more than how to thrust a spear or mend a net. He told them how to read the sky, how to know when the wind would fall, and how to listen for the sea in the rustle of the trees. He taught them the words of the prayer to Njord and the meaning of the runes carved on their doorposts. He also told them the story of the monk and the book of the woman who gave him bread in Ireland, and of the green vines of Vinland. He wanted them to understand that being a Norseman was not only about strength and raids. It was also about respect. Respect for the land that fed them, for the people they met, and for the stories they chose to tell. Freydis visited often that winter. She had made a long voyage east and brought gifts from lands beyond the river. She told the children of cities with polished stones and markets where spices scent the air. She spoke of the people she met who wore veils and the kings who ruled with written laws. Her stories filled the hall with wonder. "Your world has become wider," she said to Einar one night as they stood at the door and watched the snow fall. "But it has not forgotten the north." Einar looked at her and nodded. "The north is not just a place," he said. "It is in the way we carry ourselves when we go away. It is in the stories we bring back and the way we keep the fire." The quiet hearth was not the end of adventure. The longships still rested on the beach, and new boys still dreamed of the sea. But the hall had learned to balance the call of distant horizons with the demands of the land under their feet. It had learned that peace could be just as brave as a raid, and that a home could be defended with both spear and story. Spring came again, slowly, and with it the promise of new journeys. The boys of Hvitfjord sharpened their knives and checked their lines, and Einar watched them with a mixture of pride and tenderness. He had been one of them once, eager, restless, hungry for what lay beyond. Now he also knew the joy of a quiet hearth. The fire burned steady. The smoke wound up through the roof. The stories grew richer, not only with tales of the sea, but with the seasons of the land. The Viking Age had been a long winter and a long summer, a storm and a calm. It had changed as all ages do, but it had left behind the quiet strength of people who had learned to carry both. In the last days of winter, as the ice began to crack and the first meltwater rushed through the gullies, Einar walked to the edge of the fjord. He placed his hand on the hull of the longship, smooth and dark from the tar. He felt the familiar grain of the wood. "You have carried me far," he murmured. The sea hissed faintly at the shore. The horizon was pale with light. Einar turned back toward the hall where laughter and low voices waited. The story of the Viking Age did not end with him. It would continue in the voices of his niece, his sister, and the children who would one day grow up hearing of green lands and distant kings. It would continue in the simple act of keeping a fire glowing through the long, cold night. He came home to the quiet hearth, and in that quiet he found the heart of everything he had sailed for. The years that followed were quieter, but they were no less full. Einar grew older in the way the shore grows older when it is worn by the sea, not suddenly, but steadily, each wave leaving its mark. His hair silvered further, the lines at his eyes deepened, and his hands held both the strength of a warrior and the gentleness of a man who had learned to tend a home. The longships still came and went from Hvitfjord, but their journeys were different. Some still sailed for raiding, but many sailed for trade, for marriage, for the simple love of the sea. The boys who once dreamed only of battle now also dreamed of faraway markets, of strange words, of the white stone roofs Freydis had described from the east. Einar's niece grew into a girl who loved stories. She would sit by the hearth and demand the tale of the first longship again and again, and Einar would tell her not only of the storm and the raid, but of the woman in Ireland who gave him bread, of the man at the market who taught him the worth of a kind gesture, and of the quiet stone chapel where two worlds began to stand together. One summer, a traveler arrived with news from the south. The great King of England had died, and his people were talking of stronger walls and fewer raids. A message reached Hvitfjord asking if the village would send a handful of men to help build a new bridge over a river far away. It was not a call to arms. It was a call to help shape the world with their hands. Hvitfjord was gone by then, having passed peacefully in his sleep on a still autumn night. His memory lived in the fields he had tilled and the lessons he had given. Einar stood at the edge of the Thing mound and spoke to the gathered men. "We have sailed on angry seas and walked through war," he said. "We have also learned to build. If the world now asks us to lay stones instead of only lift shields, then that is a voyage worth taking. The sea will always be our friend. The land will always be our hearth. We can honor both." A small company went not as raiders, but as builders and guards. They returned with stories of bridges and roads of towns thick with people of children laughing in courtyards. They brought back not only goods, but the knowledge that the paths they carved could last far beyond any single lifetime. Einar watched as his old village became a place where the new and the old lived side by side. The stone chapel was complete, its cross rising against the sky. Yet the carved runes still appeared on door frames and ships. Njal still sang of Thor and Odin beside the fire, and the new priest blessed the bread before the meal. The same hands that salted fish and mended nets now also laid the foundation stones of a bridge, tied a contract in ink and leather, and welcomed strangers with warmed ale. There came a night when the snow was deep and the hall was full. The children had fallen asleep under the benches. The fire in the hearth was low, leaving a soft glow on the faces of the elders. Einar sat with Freydis and his sister. They were not as young as they had once been, but there was a peace in their quiet joy. "Do you remember Signa said when we were afraid the sea would take everything?" Einar nodded. "I remember the fear," he said. "And I remember the hope. They are two sides of the same world." Freydis smiled. "It is strange," she said. "I have sailed to far cities, and I have stood in the quiet of our hall. Both feel like home now." Outside, the wind moved through the pines and carried with it the distant murmur of the fjord. The sound was like the voice of a friend, old and steady. Einar spoke to the sleeping children then as if they could hear him in their dreams. "The Viking Age was not only the thunder of our shields," he said softly. "It was the way we chose to answer the call of the world. It was the courage to begin, the strength to endure, and the wisdom to come home." When he was very old, Einar walked to the edge of the fjord one last time with his granddaughter at his side. She pressed her small hand into his rough palm and looked out over the water eyes, wide with wonder. "Will you sail again?" she asked. Einar chuckled. "Not in the same way," he said. "But the sea will always sail in our stories. The waves you hear now carry the songs of our fathers and the hopes of your children. Listen, and you will hear them." He pointed to the longships resting on the beach, their hulls dark and calm. "Those ships are made for many things. They are for leaving and for returning. They are for carrying not only goods, but the stories that bind us." As the sun set, the fjord turned gold. The long house light glowed warm in the distance. The dragonhead prows of the ships seemed to drink in the last light. In the quiet that followed the age of the Vikings did not vanish. It became an echo in the land, a pattern in the stone, a song in the hearth, and a memory in the bones of the people. The story of Einar and of Hvitfjord ended not with a single dramatic battle, but with the simple knowledge that the greatest adventures are those that change a person from inside and make his home richer for it. The Viking Age rose from hunger and longing, from courage and curiosity, and it fell into history, not with defeat alone, but into a new world built by the same hands that once reached for the axe. And so, as the fire burned low and the hall hushed, the last thing Einar told his granddaughter was the same thing his father had said to him on the day the longship left. "Remember," he whispered, "you can sail the wide sea and still keep your heart. You can be brave enough to leave and wise enough to come back." In that quiet, the story drifted like smoke upward, gentle and endless, an old tale to sleep by, carrying the rise and fall of the Norse warriors into dreams as deep and far-reaching as the northern waters themselves. The snow melted slowly that spring, and the fjord sighed as the ice loosened and drifted away. The longhouse was alive again, with the sound of boots on packed earth, the clang of a hammer on iron, and the murmur of voices planning the year's work. The sea had not forgotten the men of Hvitfjord, and neither had they forgotten the sea. Einar's granddaughter, now old enough to walk to the shore on her own, ran ahead of him down the path. Her braids swung and her laughter rose above the gulls. She paused at the water's edge, staring at the longboats resting on the sand. Einar followed more slowly, the leather of his boots creaking in the damp grass. "Do you think they will ever stop sailing?" she asked, not looking away. Einar smiled. "No," he said. "Not as long as there are places to go and stories to bring back. The boats will always be a part of us. She picked up a smooth, flat stone and skipped it across the water. The first throw sent it dancing 3 times before it sank. Each ripple was a quiet echo. The village had become a place where the old and new lived side by side. The stone chapel's bells rang on Sundays, and the carved runes still adorned the boats and doorways. Children learned the prayers to Njord and the verses of the new faith. Men still repaired plows and mended nets, but they also discussed news from far lands brought by traders and travelers. Einar spent that spring teaching the young ones not only how to row and fight, but how to listen. He sat with them beneath the eaves of the longhouse and told them the story of the first raid, the woman in Ireland with the barley hair, the market in York, and the green fields of Vinland. He told them about the monk with the book whose eyes changed him, and about the day he chose to lay down his sword and carry something else instead. Remember, he said courage is not only the first blow you strike. It is also the choice to be kind when no one is watching, to keep your word, and to come home when the world asks you to. There were other stories, too. Stories of alliances made by marriage of bridges built from stone of kings who sought not only tribute, but peace. The village had sent men south to guard caravans, and they had returned bearing not only silver, but the knowledge that the world could be bound together by agreements as strongly as by steel. As the summer warmed, new songs were added to the skald's repertoire. Njal sang of the rise of cities to the east, of the beauty of a river that wound through a city of polished stone, and of the merchants who came with silk and glass. He sang of the simple beauty of a farm waking at dawn, of the steady work of women and men who fed their families, and of a quiet man who had learned that the truest voyage is the one that carries you back home. The boy who had once stood on the prow of a longship and listened to the fjord was no longer the only center of the story. Einar's granddaughter made the tale her own. She gathered her friends by the fire and asked them about the world beyond the cliffs. She dreamed not only of foreign shores, but of the day she might carry her own child to the water and tell them why their people sailed. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned the color of smoldering embers, Einar walked to the headland with his granddaughter. The fjord lay calm beneath them. The old longships glowed in the last light, their dragon-head prows still fierce and beautiful. "Will you tell your story in the same way I did?" she asked. Einar put his hand on her shoulder. "No," he said, "I will tell it in the way that belongs to you. Every age has its own voice. The important thing is that the story continues." She nodded. Then I will tell them about the time I met a trader from the south, and the way he bowed, and the way he laughed when I spoke some of his words. And I will tell them about the smell of pine smoke in the longhouse, and the way my grandfather's hand feels when he holds mine. Einar chuckled. Good. That is how the story stays alive. In the years that followed, the village of Hvitfjord became a place of memory and motion. Children were named for the men and women who had sailed far and returned. The longhouse walls held carved runes of family names, of voyages taken, and of promises kept. The chapel's bells rang alongside the old songs, and both prayers and tales rose together from the same hearth. The world beyond the fjord continued to change. New kings rose and fell. The markets grew busier. The old gods were still honored in stories and in the carved symbols on a man's shield, but the cross also stood in the same hall. The Viking Age did not vanish in a single breath. It transformed like the fjord itself from open water to the quiet reflection that follows. Einar lived long enough to see his great-grandchildren at the edge of the water, their eyes filled with the same restless light he had once known. He would sit with them and pass along the same truth that had carried him through every voyage. Being a Norseman means knowing both the sea and the earth, he told them. It means holding the courage to leave and the wisdom to return. It means taking care of those at home while you are away. It means remembering that the stories we tell are the bridges between the past and the future. When his time finally came, it was gentle. He slept in the longhouse he had helped shape, with the fire glowing low and his family around him. His granddaughter held his hand, her eyes wet but steady. The last thing he felt was the warmth of the hearth and the soft weight of her fingers. After Einar was gone, the story did not fade. His life became one more song in the longhouse. His granddaughter told it when her own child asked why the longboat still rested on the shore. Njál's lyre continued to play, and the hall remained a place where the past and the future met. The Viking Age had risen from hunger, from the need for land and wealth, from the fierce desire for honor and reputation. It had crossed oceans, laid stones in foreign cities, and filled the world with stories. It had also fallen not in defeat alone, but into a new world where the raiders became settlers, where warriors became traders, and where the hearth became as important as the sword. This is the echo that remains a people who listened to the sea and answered, who carried their homes in their hearts, and who understood that the greatest victories are not only those won by strength, but those won by kindness, by keeping promises, and by returning to share what was learned. May the sound of the fjord, the crackle of the hearth, and the songs of the skalds drift into your sleep. May you dream of longships on calm water, of green fields in distant lands, and of a quiet hall where stories are always waiting to be told. The years had folded into one another like the waves along the fjord, each one carrying its own light, its own storm, its own quiet. Hvitfjord had changed, and yet there was always that same hearth at its heart, the same smoke curling up through the rafters, the same rhythm of voices rising and falling with the seasons. The children who had once chased each other around the longhouse benches were now adults with their own children. The names carved into the doorposts grew longer. The runes still told the story of where a man had gone and what he had brought back, but they also marked promises made in peace to fish fairly, to share the harvest, to marry with respect. In the glow of the evening fire, the village elders gathered. The young ones, tired from their day's work in the fields or from mending sails, listened as the old skalds spoke of journeys farther than any they had made. The tales were no longer only of raids and battles. They had room now for the smell of bread in a foreign kitchen, the kindness of a stranger's hand, a moment when a man chose to build rather than to burn. Einar's story had become a quiet legend. He was remembered not only for the first blow he had struck, but for the way he had carried the world home in his heart. His granddaughter told the story differently than he had, but with the same reverence. She described the boy on the shore, the monk with the book, the woman in Ireland, the green vines of Vinland, and the day the first stone chapel rose beside the longhouse. She added the things she had seen herself, the merchants in York, the bridges in a foreign king's land, the banners of cities far to the east. Remember, she would say to her children, the world is wide, and it is also close. The sea can take you away, but the hearth can always bring you back. The young ones learned that being a Norseman was not a single story. It was 1,000 small decisions, whether to keep your word, whether to speak kindly to a stranger, whether to return to the people who loved you. It was the choice to be brave enough to leave and wise enough to come home. The world beyond the fjord continued to change. Kings grew stronger, laws were written, and the old gods were spoken of in softer voices. Yet in the valleys of the north, in halls like Hvitfjord, the old names still carried weight. Thor was still the hammer in a boy's dream. Odin was still the wise one whose runes taught men how to read the wind and the waves. Njord was still the keeper of ships. And the new names found a place too. The cross on the chapel roof shone in the sun. The prayers of the new faith mingled with the old chants. by the fire. People chose the words that fit them best. They were no longer forced to choose only one path. They could be both the children of the North and citizens of a wider world. As the years softened the sharp edges of the Viking Age, the stories did not fade. They became the lullabies that mothers sang, the lessons that fathers passed along, the memories that filled the pauses between work and rest. They were the quiet threads that tied together raids and harvests, voyages and homecomings, gods and men. In the end, the greatest legacy of the Norse warriors was not the silver they had carried, the lands they had raided, or the battles they had won. It was the knowledge they had left behind that courage is found in the sea and on the shore, that strength is not only in the arm, but in the promise you keep, that a home is made of firelight, shared stories, and the willingness to welcome both the old and the new. So, as the night deepens and the last embers glow low, imagine the fjord once more. Imagine the dragon-headed longship resting on the sand. Imagine the hall warm with smoke and with laughter. Imagine the young boy who stepped into the world and the old man who returned to tell the tale. Feel the hush of the fire, the whisper of the wind, the soft weight of a story laid down to rest. The morning after the last snow melted, the air around Hvitfjord was fresh and bright. The fjord itself shone like polished steel, and the first new reeds pushed up through the shallow water. The longhouse doors stood open, welcoming the breeze that carried the scent of salt and young grass. Einar's granddaughter, now older and steadier than before, walked along the shore with a bundle of cloth over her arm. In it were gifts and simple things for the children of the village: a carved whistle, a strip of embroidered linen, a small leather pouch filled with dried berries. She had become known as a storyteller in her own right, and the children followed her like fledglings, following a parent. She paused at the edge of the beach and looked out over the water. The longships were still there, their keels resting on the sand, black and familiar. Their dragon heads were a little worn from years of wind and wave, but they still stood proud. "Will they ever sail again?" a little boy asked, tugging at her sleeve. She smiled, feeling the same question she had once asked her grandfather. "They will sail when the world asks them to," she replied. "And even when they do not, their stories will still travel farther than any sail." The village had grown gentler with time, but it had not grown quiet. The farmers rose early to tend the fields. The women worked the looms. The men mended fences and repaired boats. There were still longships on the beach, and there were still youths who trained with shields and spears. Yet now there were also children practicing the runes beside the fire, learning to write their own names and to keep vows. The chapel bell rang that afternoon, calling people together. Some came to pray. Some came simply to listen. The old and the young stood side by side beneath the low wooden rafters. The priest spoke of mercy and of a world that could be shaped by kindness. The old skald sat in the corner, his fingers resting lightly on the lyre, ready to weave the words of the old gods into the new song. After the service, the storyteller walked to the fire. She set down her bundle and reached into it. She took out a small wooden figure. She had carved herself a boy holding an oar. The children leaned forward, eyes bright. This boy, she began, was named Einar. He was the first in our family to cross the fjord and sail beyond what he knew. He left with fear in his heart and wonder in his soul. He came back with stories that made our hall place richer. She told them not only of the first raid, the monk with the book and the green grapes in Vinland, but of things they had not heard before, of a quiet morning when Einar helped an Irish woman carry water and learned her name, of the way a southern merchant had wept when a child gave him a simple carved bead, of the first marriage between a boy from Hvitfjord and a girl from the south, and how their children sang in two tongues. The children listened until the fire burned low. They wanted to know whether Einar had ever been afraid. He had, she said. They wanted to know whether he had ever regretted his deeds. He had, she said. But more than anything, they wanted to know whether he had been happy. Yes, she said softly. He was happy in the way people are happy when they have known both the sea and the steadiness of home. He was happy when he sat by the fire and saw his niece dance, and when he felt the wind on a strange shore. He was happy when he chose to be kind as often as he chose to be brave. As the summer deepened, the village saw new faces. Traders came with cloth from far lands and glass so thin it held the light. A man from a neighboring valley brought his bride, a woman who had never seen a dragon-headed ship before. She stepped onto the beach with wide eyes and a quiet smile. The village welcomed her with warm bread and stories because that was what the hall had always done. Einar's granddaughter began to write the stories down. She used the runes carved on her family's doorpost and the new letters she had learned from the priest. She made a small book bound in leather with a handful of pages filled with the tales she had been told. The ink was black and the letters careful. On the first page, she wrote the name of the boy who had once stood on the shore and chose to leave. Stories are like oars, she told the children who helped her. They move us. They keep us from drifting. And they make the journey more than just the place we reach. One autumn, there was talk of a great council in the south. Kings and chieftains would meet to discuss peace and trade. Some of the village elders said it was like the things they had held in the old days, a place where the future could be shaped. Others said it would be dangerous, that old rivalries and new ambitions could spark like tinder. Einar's granddaughter listened. She thought of her grandfather's words about carrying the world home and about the importance of promises. She decided to go not with a sword, but with a message that Hvitfjord was willing to be part of the new peace, if it meant that their children could grow without fear. She traveled south with a small company of men and women, including some who had been traders and some who had been farmers. They carried the leather book she had made us stories of the north and the runes carved on their shields. Along the way, they passed through towns and valleys that had changed much like Hvitfjord. They crossed bridges built of stone, spoke with merchants who bartered gold for clay pots, and walked through forests where the air smelled of pine and smoke. When they reached the council, the hall was full of voices. There were men in armor, men in fine cloth, and men with no more than a cloak. There were banners of different colors and symbols, and the air hummed with the weight of many hopes. But when Einar's granddaughter stepped forward and placed her leather book on the table, the room stilled. She spoke of a village by the fjord where the longships still rested, where the old gods were still honored, and where the new faith had also found a place. "We are not the same as we were," she said, "and we are not a people without roots. We have sailed far and come back. We have burned and rebuilt. We have spoken in many tongues. We ask to be part of the peace, not because we are afraid, but because we have learned that a bridge can hold more than a wall." The council listened. Some smiled. Some frowned. But the story had been told, and the echo of the fjord had reached the halls far beyond. When she returned to Hvitfjord, the children gathered around her. They wanted to know whether peace had come. She answered truthfully, not yet fully, but there was a new understanding. New journeys would still be made. New stories would still be told. The world was changing as it always had. And in the quiet of the hall, as the fire burned low that night, she added another sentence to her book. It was simple, but it was the truest thing she knew. The Viking Age will always be the time when our people first heard the world's call and chose to answer it. But the world after that is the time when we learn to carry our stories with us and to bring them home. That is the legacy we leave for our children. The fjord continued to shimmer. The longships rested ready for whatever call came next. The hearth glowed, warming the faces of the next generation. The story carried on as all good stories do, not ending, but becoming the quiet flame that guides those who will one day step onto the shore and look out at the water, wondering what lies beyond. The years after the council passed like the slow sweep of the tide. The firmer the world grew around Hvitfjord, the more the village learned to carry both memory and change. The longships still slept on the beach, but their keels were not the only things that grounded the people. The hearth was a new anchor, and the stories were the ropes that tied everyone together. Einar's granddaughter, now a woman whose hair had streaks of silver, kept her leather book close. It had become heavier with each page, not only from ink, but from the weight of all the lives it recorded. She added the names of those who had sailed south as escorts of the traders who brought glass and spice, of the children who learned to write their names in both runes and letters. She wrote of the day the council listened, of the bridge over the river far away, and of the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. One spring morning, when the air was still cool and the first buds trembled on the willow branches, a young boy came to her with a question. His eyes were bright, and his hands smelled of fresh tar from the boats. "Will our stories ever end?" he asked. She looked at him, the same wonder she had once carried, looking out over the fjord. "No," she said, setting the book on her lap. "They change shape like waves. They keep moving. There will always be new beginnings, because there will always be someone who takes their first step away from what they know." She told him then about the way the world had once seemed so wide and mysterious to a boy named Einar. She told him how he had been afraid and how he had still chosen to go. She told him how the monk's eyes had taught him that every act of taking also carried the cost of what was lost. She told him about the woman in Ireland who offered him bread, and about the green vines of Vinland. Most importantly, she told him how Einar learned in the quiet years afterward that you could be a warrior and still tend a hearth. The boy listened closely. He was not the only one. More children gathered around, and soon the longhouse was full again of small, eager faces. They leaned into the story like sailors leaning into a wind that would carry them to some distant shore. Outside, the fjord reflected the sky. The dragon-headed prows of the longships were dark and patient. The stone chapel bell tolled softly in the distance, calling the villagers to a simple afternoon gathering. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the open door. The longhouse was alive with the rhythms of work and rest. In the fields beyond, men and women tended the land with the same attention they had once given to preparing for a voyage. A young woman named Ingrid, named for Einar's mother, walked among the rows of barley. She had never sailed beyond the fjord, but she knew its voice. She knew the stories her grandmother told, and she felt the same curiosity in her bones. She would one day tell her own children why the sea mattered and why the hearth mattered too. As the day turned toward evening, the villagers gathered in the hall. Njaal's old lyre had long since been passed down, and now a new pair of fingers coaxed its strings. The music rose in a gentle, looping melody. A priest murmured a blessing of thanks. A young trader from the south brought news of a new road being built through the valley stone laid by hands that had once held axes. Einar's granddaughter stood and spoke once more. "We have learned to listen to the sea and to the earth," she said. "We have learned that the world is both a place of leaving and a place of returning. We will keep our stories and we will keep our hearths. In doing so, we make a promise to those who come after us that they may choose their own path, but they will always have a place to come home to." Her words were a quiet oath, but they carried far. The children left that night with their own stories shifting inside them, ready to be told in the years ahead. The tale of the Viking Age had begun with a boy named Einar and the sound of the fjord. It had moved through the first raid across wide waters into the long summer of the Northmen, through the storm of change and into the quiet hearth of home. Now it became something else entirely, a story that crossed time past gently from one generation to the next. The longship at the shore was still there, but it was no longer the only thing that mattered. The hearth, the book, the chapel, and the field were all part of the same voyage. Each day was a new page. Each season was a new turn in the tale. And so, as the fire in the longhouse burned low and the wind whispered through the pines, the people of Hvitfjord fell asleep with the sound of the fjord in their ears. They dreamt of wide seas and warm homes of ships and stone of gods and prayers of battles and kindness. They slept with the knowledge that their story would carry on softly and surely as long as there were people who wished to listen. The sun climbed higher each day, and the fjord shimmered beneath a thinner blue sky. The longhouse was no longer just the heart of a single family. It had become a place where the whole valley gathered to share news, make decisions, and pass stories from one generation to the next. Einar's granddaughter had grown into a wise woman, and the book of stories at her side had become a village treasure. She would sit by the hearth with children of all ages and tell them how the first voyage began. But she also began to speak more of the future than of the past. She spoke of the world beyond the fjord, not only as a place of distant wonders, but as a place where the people of Hvitfjord could find new partners, new friends, and new ways to keep their home strong. One morning, as the sea mist lifted and light touched the dragon-head prows of the boats, a messenger arrived from the east. His cloak was unfamiliar, his horse tired from a long ride. He brought a symbol, a carved wooden figure of a wolf, painted black. It was from a village further down the coast, a place where the river met the sea, and where the people had learned to sail in the same way the Northmen did. "We have heard of your hall," the messenger said, his voice grave. "We have heard of your stories. We come with an offer of trade and with a request for wisdom. Our young men wish to learn from those who have sailed far and returned. Our elders wish to hear the tales of peace as well as war. The people of Hvitfjord gathered at once. In the hall, the air was thick with the smell of stew and fresh-cut pine. Children pressed close to the fire, eyes wide. The elders nodded to each other. A new path was opening, not out to sea this time, but along the shore toward others who also knew the rhythm of oars and the whisper of waves. Einar's granddaughter stood and spoke clearly. "We will teach them what we have learned," she said. "We will share our stories, our craft, and our bread. We will also learn from them. There is strength in joining hands, and there is honor in listening." So a small company prepared to go east, not as raiders, but as guests and teachers. Among them were young men who had grown up on stories of far lands, women who had known both the chapel and the old runes, a priest who carried both cross and kindness, and a storyteller with a book that held the voice of the fjord. The journey was different from the first long voyage Einar had made. It was calmer in the way a steady wind is calmer than a storm, yet it was no less important. The boats moved along the coast, passing cliffs and pastures, greeting new villages with smoke signals and waves. Each stop brought new foods, new crafts, and new words. In the eastern village, the Northmen were welcomed with curiosity. The river folk had built tall houses on stilts and had long poles to push their boats through shallow waters. They spoke a language that was sharp and quick, but they smiled as the Hvitfjord travelers recited the greetings they had learned. The two peoples traded tools, stories, and song. The eastern villages showed the Northmen how to weave nets from a certain grass that held fish better. The Northmen taught them the names of the stars that guided them across the sea. Around a shared fire, a young boy from the east learned the old prayer to Njord, and a girl from Hvitfjord learned a song from the east that spoke of river spirits. Einar's granddaughter watched and felt something settle in her heart. The Viking Age had begun with crossing water for wealth and glory. Now it moved into a gentler season where the same crossing could mean friendship and shared knowledge. When she returned to Hvitfjord, she brought with her not only the woven nets and the songs, but also a gift that mattered most, a promise. The eastern village agreed to send teachers of their own to come and learn the ways of the fjord in return. They agreed to stand together if new dangers arose, not as warriors poised to strike, but as neighbors ready to protect their shared shores. That spring, the children of Hvitfjord learned a new kind of lessons. They practiced not only how to row and how to sharpen a spear, but also how to listen to another person's song, how to braid reeds into stronger ropes, and how to make peace with a neighbor across the water. The longhouse buzzed with the same energy as before, but now the stories carried a different tone. They spoke of bridges, both of wood and of trust. A year later, a woman arrived with a child whose hair was darker than most in the valley. She had come from the far south, a place where the sun warmed the earth longer and where the markets were crowded with colors Einar's granddaughter had only read about. The woman carried a small box carved from foreign wood, and inside was seeds of a plant that grew spicy leaves and bright flowers. "I was given these in trade," the woman said, through a translator. "I wish to plant them here if the soil will let them grow." They planted the seeds together in a small garden near the longhouse. The children watched as green shoots appeared and climbed toward the sun. The soil of the north had changed once again, but it still held the same promise that what is planted with care can grow even in a land once thought too harsh. The journey forward was not without challenge. Old men still remembered raids as the only true way to honor the gods. New kings still tried to bind the valleys with laws that sometimes felt distant. The sea still roared in storms that tested the best-built boats. But the people of Hvitfjord had learned something more valuable than fear or anger. They had learned the power of choice. One autumn, when the light was thin and the fjord mirrored the sky, Einar's granddaughter stood before the hall and spoke to the gathered people. "We are not the first to sail," she said. we are not the only ones to trade, but we are the ones who chose to learn from every voyage. We chose to carry the lessons home and to make our home ready for those who come to us. The Viking Age may have begun as a time of warriors, but it lives on as a time of people who listened to the water and then listened to each other. The hall hummed with agreement. The children at the fire clapped, and the elders nodded. Outside, the wind moved the smoke from the hearth into the evening sky, and the smell of stew wrapped the valley in comfort. The story continued, always forward, always changing. The longship on the shore was no longer the only sign of a voyage. The garden, the chapel, the book, the new friends from the east and south, each of these was a part of the same journey. And so the people of Hvitfjord stepped into the future with the same courage as their ancestors. They sailed not only to find riches, but to find how to live together in a world that had grown wider and kinder. The Viking Age had become a story of many paths, and the journey forward was one they would walk together. The waters of the fjord were softer now, warmed not only by the sun, but by the knowledge that their people had learned to follow more than one kind of current. The longships still lay on the sands, their hulls dark and patient, but the boats were joined by carts carrying grain and by merchants with their packs. The village had become a place where the old fjord road met the new road of shared stories. Einar's granddaughter walked through the village and saw the results of the journeys taken in more than one direction. A stable where once only shields had been hung now also held saddles and harnesses used for the traders' horses. A young man from the eastern village had married the daughter of a Hvitfjord farmer, and their children spoke both tongues as easily as they breathed. The stone chapel's bell still rang, and the carved runes at the doorways still held the weight of the old oaths. One autumn morning, the villagers gathered to clear the road that led from the hall to the eastern path. The work was simple, pushing stones, cutting brush, smoothing the ruts, but it was important. The path was not just earth. It was a sign that the people here were committed to keeping the world connected. As they worked, the storyteller stood and spoke. "We have always sailed beyond the fjord," she said. "Now we also walk beyond it. Our fathers crossed open water, and we walk across shared ground. The world is wide enough for both." A boy named Jorund nodded. He was only 12, with mud on his boots and a smile on his face. "Will we keep doing this even when there are new kings and new laws?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "Because the work of a people is not finished when the war ends. It keeps going as long as you choose to keep making peace-building bridges and listening to one another. That evening, after the road was cleared and the sun had dipped low, the hall filled with a new song. Njaal's old lyre had been passed along to a younger player whose fingers were quick and sure. The song was born from the river folk, but it had been shaped by the longhouse's heartbeat. It spoke of journeys down river of boats, sliding through reeds of the sound of voices carried on the wind. Einar's granddaughter listened, her eyes on the flame. She felt the story of her people changing shape again. The Viking Age had begun with a sea-born courage. It was now becoming a story of shared paths, paths of trade, paths of laws, paths of families joined across borders. The old gods still had their place in the songs, and the new faith still had its place in the prayers. Both were held together in the same hall. A messenger arrived from the south not long after. He brought word that the bridge the Hvitfjord men had helped build was finished. People came from far and wide to walk across it, and the market nearby grew busier. The messenger also carried news of a new monastery that had taken root not far from the eastern village, where monks tended gardens and learned the northern songs. The world was weaving itself into a tapestry that included the people of the fjord. The storyteller added these events to her leather book. She wrote of the bridge and of the monastery of the road cleared with mud on hands and laughter in the air, and of the boy Jorund who asked whether peace would last. She wrote of a village that had decided to carry both its fierce past and its peaceful future. In the years to come, the people of Hvitfjord would continue to sail to trade, to build, and to tell stories. There would be storms and hard winters, as there always were. There would also be festivals where strangers danced together under the same roof, and there would be quiet nights when a parent read the story of Einar to a child and watched the child drift to sleep with the fjord's whisper in their dreams. The paths had intertwined, and the village had become richer for it. The Viking Age had stretched into something broader and kinder, not because it had forgotten its origins, but because it had chosen to carry them forward with the same courage that once pushed a boy into a longship and the same wisdom that later warmed his heart. The fire in the longhouse burned low, but it had not gone out. It had changed like the people who kept it moving from the bright flare of first voyages to the steady glow of a life that held both sea and home. The hall of Hvitfjord was warm with voices old and young, familiar and new. Outside, the fjord lay calm at surface, reflecting the last of the day's light. Einar's granddaughter stood by the hearth with her leather book in hand. She had written the story she had been given, adding the chapters of her own life and the years that had followed. She closed the book, feeling the quiet weight of what it contained: the first raid, the markets of Ireland, the green fields of Vinland, the rising stone chapel, the bridge built with shared hands, the roads cleared toward friendly shores. She felt the echo of her grandfather's oar strokes in the way she held the story now. Around her, the village had become a living memory. Children learned to row and to read. Men and women tended fields and traded with neighbors both near and far. The old songs of Thor and Odin still rose with the smoke from the hearth, and new prayers rose with them too. The longships still waited on the beach, ready for the call of any sea. The road to the east was open, and the path of the village was chosen not only by the wind, but by the care they gave one another. She spoke softly, so that the youngest in the hall could hear. "We began with the sound of the fjord," she said. "We went out because the world was wide and hungry. We returned because our home was strong enough to hold us." The Viking Age rose from the need to survive and the courage to explore. It fell not when we stopped sailing, but when we learned that our truest voyage is the one that brings us back to the hearth with new stories to warm it. The embers glowed like old eyes. The smoke drifted upward, carrying the words into the rafters. Outside, the night was quiet, filled only with the distant whisper of waves and the soft breath of pines. This was the ending, and also the beginning. A people who had once been known as Norse warriors had become neighbors, traders, builders, story keepers. They had not abandoned their fire. They had simply learned to let it burn in more than one way. Sleep now with the image of the longhouse in your mind, the fjord beyond it, and the knowledge that the last story is not the loudest one, but the one that keeps a hearth warm long after the battle is over. Good night.